Hey guys, so if you've ever seen my power rankings before, particularly with Survivor, you're probably aware that I place such a heavy emphasis on the edit when assessing players based on how likely I think they are to win the game, even more so than their current game position or how I think they're playing the game. And I know that in light of what's happened in recent seasons, I'm sure some of you have probably wondered why I continue to do so, as we saw both on 43 and with 41, outcomes that weren't necessarily anticipated. And it's gotten to the point that I've heard some people say that Edgic is dead, that we shouldn't rely upon tricks anymore, that because Erica won, that means that anything goes now and that we should just be in it for the ride. And I simply don't agree with that. I still think that Edgic is alive, that it can still be looked at, and it can still be used as a way of determining who's going to win any given season of Survivor. And in this video, I wanted to provide a general overview of Edgic, at least in the context of Survivor US, as it's a topic that really interests me and I want to start making more videos like this on this channel. Now, I might make more videos in the future talking about more specific concepts within Edgic. However, this video is meant to be a more general overview of basic ideas within Edgic, as well as how it applies to the modern era. And I should acknowledge that I'm not the only person on YouTube that has made videos about Edgic before, but I still think it's worth talking about. So first off, I should provide a general definition of Edgic as a concept, where the term is a portmanteau of the words edit and logic, and it's basically the idea that on edited reality shows like Survivor, The Circle, The Amazing Race, and others, that with the amount of footage that they need to collect in order to make the show, that they need to edit it down to its most essential components, and that all the footage you see on the edited show is carefully selected to fulfill a very specific purpose that the show is trying to achieve. Now, usually that purpose is to present the events of the show in a way that's coherent, entertaining, and satisfying to the viewer. But something you'll notice with each of these different reality shows is that they may have a slightly different way of going about that purpose, and through that comes a series of trends and tropes that the production teams of those shows like to implement in order to tell a coherent, satisfying, and entertaining narrative. We can look no further than the three main versions of Survivor that I cover on this channel, that being Australian Survivor, Survivor US, and Survivor South Africa, where I feel like these three shows each fall on a spectrum in terms of how they want to present their show. Where on one end of the spectrum you have Survivor SA, which largely tries to present the events at face value and give the characters on the show content based on their relevance to the events of the season as they come up. And while this is usually an accurate way of presenting the season playing out, it may not always lend itself to a coherent narrative. And while that can lead to some very unpredictable outcomes that can make the seasons more entertaining, it may not always explain why the winner of the season wins the season, and through that the winner may not always be the most satisfying one. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Australian Survivor, where its main purpose is to make the winner feel as satisfying and deserving as possible by giving them so much content to where they are very obviously the winner from early on. The show goes out of its way to give them as much screen time as possible, to explain all their personal content, their strategy, and make you feel like they are the greatest Survivor player to ever live. And while that may lead to you feeling like this is a coronation of that winner, and that you may walk away understand the player's game fully, even to the point where it feels repetitive, it also may not always be the best reflection of the actual events of the game, and can definitely lead some players being under-edited. And then that leaves Survivor US, which I think is a pretty satisfying middle ground between Survivor SA and Australian Survivor, where on one hand, I feel like Survivor US definitely tries to give its players a more balanced edit in order to help us understand each of the players within the game more, and in general provide a more accurate sense of how the game is playing out, but at the same time provide a general narrative using a series of trends and tropes in order to tell a satisfying story of the winner and explain how the winner ultimately wins the game, which explains the winner edit. And since Survivor US has been on for well over 40 seasons at this point, this set of trends and tropes have been pretty well established at this point, to where each season comes with a very robust discussion among the Edgic community over who the top contenders are episode by episode, until ultimately leads to us determining who the winner is. Now before we continue, I wanted to give a couple disclaimers regarding Edgic. First up, I should clarify that Edgic is not a formula. While I will be discussing some of the specific tropes that people look for when determining who the winner is and more technical concepts, Edgic at the end of the day is not simply checking off boxes and determining who has the most elements of a winner. At the end of the day, context matters a lot with assessing a season of the show, so it's very important to acknowledge that. Next up, Edgic evolves over time, and it's something that very much changes as the editors decide to switch things up, and in more recent seasons, recognize that there's this community that has picked up on their game. So we definitely have seen seasons that try to switch things up, both from a storytelling perspective, but also just to throw us off. And it's this perpetual game of cat and mouse that makes it so that not every season is going to be 100% predictable. So that's something else to keep in mind. And the final disclaimer, and probably the most important one, is that on any given season, multiple people can check off multiple key boxes for a winner's edit, and I think this is something that gets left out of a lot of discussions about the winner's edit, including other YouTube videos that talk about it, where it's very easy to filter out cases where the winners of a given season check off key boxes that fulfill a winner's edit. But when you're actually watching the season play out, you're going to see these things play out with multiple people. You'll see multiple people get positive content that could lead to stuff moving forward. And there's a lot of stuff that on paper would lead to someone winning, when in reality it would serve a different purpose. So really the thing about the winner's edit and really analyzing the edit is being able to eliminate people as his season goes along, and not only tell what constitutes a winner's edit, but what are some red herrings that can cause people to fall out of contention as well, that makes the actual winners stand out when they actually check off those boxes versus when other people do that. And I think this has become even more relevant in recent seasons, where we have seen the rise of decoy winners, and we've seen the rise in personal content really across the entire cast, where on 41, 42, 43, we're seeing even like early boots getting all this positive personal content where they get to talk about their lives, and that could lead to, in certain cases, people making a deep run, when in reality there are other things that could be overlooked that could cause them to be labeled as an early boot or not winning the game. So I hope that's something that I can potentially shed some light on, and at the end of the day, this is all a learning process as well. I'm not saying that I'm perfect at reading the edit either. However, I think these are key things to keep in mind as we talk about various Edgic concepts. So first up, I want to talk about Edgic charts, which are a pretty common thing you'll see within the Edgic community, as it's essentially a chart that documents the content that people get from episode to episode on a given season. Now, there's this great article by Inside Survivor that goes through a lot of these concepts and provides a general introduction to Edgic as well. Now, granted, it was written back in 2015, so things have changed to a degree since then, but I still think it's a valuable tool that can definitely shed some light on things. Now, if you look at these charts, it basically breaks down each contestant's content from episode to episode, and for each episode, each player is going to get a rating. Now, this rating consists of 3 components. The first one is their relevance within the story. Now, despite some of these terms, this is different from their overall visibility, which is another category we'll get into in a moment. It's more so speaking to their overall significance within the narrative for that episode, where on one hand you have invisible, which means that the player in question is pretty irrelevant and very much invisible to the overall events of the episode. They're not really that important. On the other hand, you have over the top, which, despite being on the opposite end of the spectrum, is not necessarily a good thing. It's more so speaking to characters that are essentially caricatures, and they're presented as pretty one-dimensional, and they're usually the characters you'll see that create drama. And while this can be good in terms of a visibility standpoint, it's not really good for determining a winner, as usually on a given season, they don't want to present their winner as being over the top too often. Really, the main thing that defines strong contenders is the category right below it, which is complex personality. And really, this is when we see the character being presented as important, as well-rounded, and well-developed, and we see them being essentially a 3-dimensional character. And usually you'll see a decent amount of winners getting a decent amount of episodes with this type of content. Now, with that said, you don't want too many episodes with complex personality, as usually that'll make a winner too obvious. which, as we'll see later on in the video, generally Survivor US doesn't want to make their winners too obvious, and usually characters that get too much complex content are usually either decoy winners or people taken out around the early merge. And then these other categories are under the radar and middle of the road, which are exactly what they say they are. They're more so characters that aren't overarching within the story, but they're not necessarily invisible either. They're more so just coming up as they come up. So you'll usually see people fall into that category more often than not, although you'll definitely have cases where people fall into one of these extremes. The next category is tone, which is exactly what it says it is, where it's largely determined by how the character is presented, whether positively or negatively. Now, again, this falls into a spectrum where on one hand you have super negative, now on the other hand you have super positive. Now, unlike the other category, it's actually relatively rare for Edgic tables to label people as being super positive or super negative, as it's usually reserved for more extreme cases, where on the one hand you have super negative being reserved for usually problematic characters or people that severely get dunked in the edit. You have Drew Christie during his boot episode in Samuel Del Sur. You have Will Sims in the episode of Worlds Apart where he gets into the Shirin conflict. And obviously you have Jeff Varner in his boot from Game Changers, which I don't need to say more about. And on the other hand, super positive is mainly reserved for cases in which the edit goes above and beyond to glorify certain players, usually when they're on their way out, but there are other exceptions. So you have like Rudy Bosch's boot from Survivor All-Stars, you have Stephanie LaGrossa being all alone on Oolong during Palau, you have Dan Barry's boot from Panama, which was really ridiculous. You also have Taj from the Loved Ones visit in Tocantins. So there are still some cases of people getting super positive edits, but more often than not, you'll definitely see players on any given episode ranging from mixed to regular positive to regular negative. And as I alluded to earlier, winners are generally presented in a mixed or positive light. It's very rare for a winner to be presented in a negative light for any consistent period of time. Now, there may be some exceptions, usually around the end of the season, where they want to throw in some doubt that maybe the winner may not win the season, but more often than not, the edit wants to go out of its way to highlight the winner's perspective on things, which usually does not warrant a negative edit. And then the third category is visibility, which is what it says it is. It's basically just how visible the character is in a given episode, with 1 being the least visible and 5 being the most visible. So with all these things in mind, we can start to piece together how a player's edit will change over the course of the season, episode by episode. And there usually isn't a formula for how a winner will be edited in this way, as usually context matters a lot more. But with that said, I think that winners are generally presented in a positive light. They usually get a decent amount of complex content, though not too much to the point where they become too obvious, and they are generally visible, but not to the point where they're overexposed. So I think that's a usually helpful way of seeing winners, although when viewed in this way, it's not necessarily a formula. I think what is more useful in determining a winner is looking at the specific tropes that you see certain players get within their edits in the actual show. Now, I'm not going to get too detailed with this, as I do want to explore these concepts more in other videos. However, I do want to provide a general list of things you can look for to identify a winner's edit. One is a winner's quote, where the winner will literally say that they're going to win the game. I think the most prominent example of this is Richard Hatch in Survivor Borneo, where he literally says in the premiere, "But I've got the $1 million check written already. I mean, I'm the winner." So that's something to look out for. Also, strong personal content with a mostly positive tone, which I referred to more in the previous section, but paying attention for that. Also, if the winner identifies themselves with the overarching themes of the season, if any. Now, this may not always be clear, however, usually if the season has a specific casting theme like David versus Goliath, or blue collar versus white collar versus no collar, you can expect the winner to talk about how they relate to these themes, or in some ways how they are a combination of these various groups that appear different on paper, but they're able to combine the strengths of all these groups in order to rise above the rest. Also, key relationships established in the premiere, a notable presence during key episodes, so the premiere, the swap, the merge episodes, if the winner is someone who gets a lot of content within those episodes and a lot of important content within those episodes, then that's usually a good sign for their edit. The winner is also usually credited for important moves during the season, such as major blindsides, but even just getting a chance to explain their strategy or their view of the game, even if they don't necessarily get their way, if the show seems to be going out of its way to make sure they are included within what's happening, then that's usually a good sign. And more generally speaking, the winner is rarely undercut by other people, and if we ever hear other people speak badly of the winner, then the winner will usually get the last word. However, while many winners will have at least some of these key tropes, I think the single most important thing about the winner's edit is not so much about checking off all these boxes and wowing people with their Edgic charts. It's more so about their storyline across the season. As I mentioned earlier, Survivor US is very invested in telling a coherent, satisfying, and entertaining story, and along with that comes with explaining how the winner wins the season, how they navigate the game, and ultimately by the end we see them accomplish their goal and win the season. In many ways, it's like watching a movie where the winner is the main character and we see their goals established from early on. We see the tools and the people that they'll be able to interact with and work with in order to help accomplish their goal by the end of it. And the show goes out of its way to ensure that they have a consistent storyline, a storyline that is rarely undercut by other elements such as their actions within the game or other editing tricks that make them come off differently than how they say themselves to be. And I think this leads right into a discussion of how winners have been presented in the new era, where Edgic is supposedly dead and how we can't rely on the edit anymore to be able to tell that a winner is going to win the seasons. Now, am I saying that I predicted Erica was going to win 41 from early on? No, I didn't. However, as the season progressed, it started to make more sense how an Erica win could happen. She does say early on that she's going to lay low, how she's going to be this lamb that's eventually going to come out as a lion. And based on her edit in the pre-merge, it makes sense why she would say that, why that would be her storyline, as she isn't really that relevant during the pre-merge. She is lying low. And yes, while she is being targeted, her opposition is Deshawn, who is clearly set up to be the villain. And that is a key relationship that is established from early on. Her relationship with Deshawn, or I guess in this case, her rivalry with Deshawn. And that makes sense once it transitions into the post-merge, where Erica does start to slowly come out a bit more, until by the end, it's her against Deshawn, this main rivalry that's been set up throughout the season. And with Erica being the lion, she comes out and she devours Deshawn in a jury vote. So to that end, Erica does have a clear storyline. She has a moment where she lies low, and then she has her big coming out moment at the merge when she smashes the hourglass and changes the game. And from that point on, she navigates through the game until eventually she's able to come out on top. So I think while Erica was not the most predictable winner in the world, and even I didn't necessarily see her coming, when we look back on 41 and we start to see how it could have happened, the pieces start to fall into place, and the storyline theory that I laid out earlier makes sense for Erica. It explains her strategy, it explains why she wasn't as present in the edit, and why she ultimately wins despite that storyline taking place. Now, I think a good way to contrast that is with Omer from Survivor 42, who on paper seems similar, where he had this confessional early on about him being this owl in the night despite him coming off as a pelican or whatever. However, despite him trying to live off that image, he is consistently present throughout the pre-merge, where we are constantly seeing content from him. And while a lot of that is complex content, and while a lot of it's personal content, it completely contradicts his whole confession at the beginning, where he said he was going to be this more under the radar player that people aren't going to see coming. And through that, there's this clear contradiction with Omer's storyline that was not present with Erica's in 41. And that undercuts Omer's edit to the point where it doesn't make as much sense for him to win. Compare that with Marianne, who set up her storyline from very early on as being this weird kid, and her wanting to prove that she can win the game as a weird kid to be an example for people that grew up like her. And we see throughout the pre-merge that she doesn't quite fit in. She gets into arguments with Jonathan. There are points where she's talked about as being part of the bottom, where she's almost being rejected like she was probably when she was younger, when she was seen as this weird kid. So it makes sense why Marianne would have that sort of storyline, considering the poor position she was in for so much of the pre-merge. But even moving forward, as Omer's getting more content, is being set up more as his big player, we see that Marianne's big move is to eventually take out Omer. And by the end, she rises to the point where she's able to take out Omer, who through all of his consistent content and all his big game talk, comes off as this big obstacle for Marianne to overcome. And by Marianne getting the credit for taking out Omer, she's able to emerge as the frontrunner, and it makes sense why at the end, when she uses that as one of her biggest points on her resume, that is something that the jury resonates with. So in that regard, we see that even on Survivor 42, this storyline idea still works, where it explains why Marianne wins, but it also explains Omer's edit, why it doesn't make sense for him to be the winner, how he contradicts his own storyline, and how a lot of his constant content serves not to explain why he wins, but to explain why he is such a big obstacle that would garner Marianne respect in the case where she takes credit for his eventual blindside. So again, the storyline idea holds up for Survivor 42. And then we get to Survivor 43, which in many ways has renewed this discussion about Edgic being dead, how all these people thought that there was no way Jesse couldn't win, and that after Jesse got taken out, that there was no way that Cassidy couldn't win, and how when Gabler won, it just completely shocked the world to the point where it's another Erica situation. However, if we are going based on the storyline model, it makes sense why Gabler wins over both of those people, where Cassidy is someone who, again, gets a similar content to Erica and Omer, where she talks about being more under the radar, but throughout the season, she never really gets much of a storyline beyond that, and she never gets credit for making any critical moves throughout the season, at least within the edit. You have Jesse, who despite him getting a similar edit to that of Omer, and him getting a lot of personal content, with him being shown being this big player, that he never really has much of a storyline beyond just providing for his family, and even then, that doesn't even come up until towards the end game, after he is able to wrap around taking out Cody at the final 6. But before that, he is someone who is just being presented as a big player. And then you have Gabler, who gets a very consistent storyline throughout the season, where early on, his main focus is on Ellie and his confrontation with her. His relationship with Ellie is set up from episode 1, and he's laser focused on it. We see it evolve into a rivalry, and at the merge, he gets the credit for taking out Ellie. That storyline culminates, he makes his big move, and he takes out Ellie. But then immediately after, despite the fact that this could have just been the end of Gabler's storyline, we see it continue, where he gets this new content about him laying low, and now he's just going to lay back and rely on his social bonds. And believe it or not, he actually does that. We see him building these relationships with Jesse, with Cody, and then later with Owen and with Cassidy. We see him planting seeds about Jesse. We see that content of him at the final 8 before the Noel Tribal, where he talks about how Jesse's this big player and needs to be taken out. Later on, he gets another confessional about how if you're going to take out the king, that you don't just simply storm the castle, that you put poison into the bowl and then walk out. Again, these are all things that point to Gabler being a more under the radar player. It isn't an accident that Gabler isn't being shown making big moves, because it's his strategy that's been established from earlier on in the season that he's going to lay low. And the fact that he gets his intro package right after the merge, after he gets his established storyline of him laying low, makes sense, as him laying low is a big reason why he wins the game at the end. He had already made his move of taking out Ellie, and his next move wouldn't come until later in the game where he takes out Jesse. But before that, he's able to rely on him being less of a threat to make people trust him, to the point of him building these alliances and building these final 3 deals. And we see that eventually culminate with him taking out the biggest threat in the game in Jesse, which again was established at the final 7. So again, Gabler is another case where the storyline model works. He is someone whose game is very well explained. He is someone who has very clearly defined relationships throughout the game, and it makes sense why he's able to win the game at the end, especially over Cassidy and Owen. Now yes, I didn't quite predict that at the time. I felt like I was very conflicted going to the finale of 43, as despite me recognizing that Gabler could have this consistent storyline, that I still had some doubt that I couldn't see Gabler actually being the winner. And yet, despite me having these doubts, Gabler was the winner. And I feel like that is a testament to how Edgic is still very much alive even in the new era, how despite it being an evolving art and how the editors continue to deny that Edgic exists, it is still something that we can turn to see who's going to be important in a season. It is still important for seeing how the season is going to play out. And obviously, it factors a lot into the overall experience of watching the season and seeing the entertainment value of the season play out, to see how they spin the actual events of the season into a coherent, satisfying, and entertaining story. So I think that's a general overview of Edgic, and I hope that this video really cleared some things up about it, maybe some misconceptions about it, and maybe spark some interest in looking at the edit more moving forward, even though people are saying that Edgic may be dead. So there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, I do want to make more general Survivor content like this moving forward, so stay tuned for that. I am planning to cover shows like Australian Survivor, Heroes vs. Villains, as well as Survivor 44 once those come out, so stay tuned for that as well. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to join in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that's the video. See ya.